The stone refused to move. It sat half-buried in the scree slope, a slab of granite the size of a coffin, its surface scoured by 1,000 years of wind. Ilara leaned her shoulder into it, boots scrabbling for purchase on the loose shale, the muscles in her back and legs screaming a tight, hot protest. Beside her, Silas the mule strained against his harness, the leather creaking like a ship's mast in a gale. His ears were laid flat, his breath coming in great dusty snorts that misted in the thin, high-altitude air. Nothing. The stone was an anchor holding them to a dead mountain. She straightened up, wiping a smear of grit from her brow with the back of a raw-knuckled hand. Her gaze drifted down the slope to the cluster of buildings huddled in the valley below. Silver Creek. From up here, it looked like a handful of discarded chips tossed into a dusty bowl. Smoke rose from only a quarter of the chimneys. The great ore processing mill by the river was silent, its skeletal frame a monument to a prosperity that had vanished as surely as the silver veins had pinched out into worthless rock. They had driven her out after the last mine failed, after her father, the company engineer, had died with the town's hope. They gave her his meager effects, the mule, and a wide berth, their whispers following her like carrion birds. She was the daughter of the man who had failed them. Silas nudged her hand with his soft nose, his dark eyes intelligent and patient. He trusted her. It was a trust she felt as a physical weight, a responsibility heavier than any stone. She ran a hand down his neck, feeling the tense muscle. "I know," she murmured, her voice a low rasp. "Just one more." She walked around the stone, her eyes tracing its fractures, seeking a new point of leverage. In the worn leather satchel slung over her shoulder was her grandfather's journal. She didn't need to look at it. She had memorized the diagrams, the spidery script filled with calculations and theories the mining company had dismissed as madness. "The Earth's heat is a constant," he had written, "a river of warmth flowing beneath the frost. One need only know how to tap the current." This stone was not for a grave, as the townspeople believed. It was for a foundation, the first of 200. Down in the town, Jedediah Thorne watched from the porch of the empty assayer's office, his face a roadmap of wrinkled disapproval. He'd spent 40 years pulling silver from this mountain, and he knew rock. He knew futility when he saw it. "What in God's name is that girl doing?" he asked the dusty air. "Digging her own tomb?" Mayor Thompson, passing by on his way to foreclose on another property, adjusted his waistcoat and sniffed. "It's a disgrace, an eyesore. Her father filled her head with nonsense, and now she's making a monument to it. Let her. Winter will teach her a lesson her father never could." Ilara ignored their imagined voices. She had heard the real ones enough. She repositioned the iron pry bar, jamming its tip deep into a fissure near the stone's base. She found a smaller, flat rock to use as a fulcrum, just as the journal's diagrams had shown. She put her weight on the end of the bar, a slow, steady pressure. Silas seemed to understand, leaning into the harness at the exact same moment. There was a deep, groaning sound, the sound of earth giving up something it had held for a long time. The great stone shifted, scraping over the smaller rocks beneath it, and slid a precious 6 inches. It was enough. A week later, Martha Gable made the trek up the path to Ilara's claim. She carried a small pot of thin rabbit stew, its meager warmth already leaching into the cooling afternoon. She found Ilara not digging, but setting a line of heavy timbers into a trench that ran along the base of the excavation. The hole in the mountainside was now immense, a clean-cut rectangle 20 feet deep and 50 feet long, shored up with a lattice of reclaimed wood from the abandoned mine shafts. The first course of foundation stones, including the one that had resisted so fiercely, was now perfectly in place. "Ilara, child," Martha said, her voice laced with a genuine, painful concern. "This is madness. The snows will be here in a month. There are still wagons heading down to the flatlands. You can't stay here alone." Ilara looked up from her work. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hair tied back in a messy knot, but her eyes were clear and direct. She took the offered stew with a quiet nod of thanks. "I'm not alone," she said, gesturing with her head towards Silas, who was methodically chewing on a patch of hardy mountain grass nearby. "A mule is not company, it's livestock," Martha insisted, her hands fluttering. "What is all this? People are saying you've lost your mind, that you're trying to dig a new mine by hand." Ilara took a sip of the stew. It was warm and salty. She looked at the structure taking shape, seeing not the hole that Martha saw, but the walls, the insulated roof, the glass panels that would face the southern sun. She saw the deep channel she'd dug to the geothermal vent her grandfather had marked on his maps, the one that even now breathed a faint, steady plume of warm, mineral-scented air. "I have a plan," she said. It was all the explanation she ever gave. Martha sighed, a sound of utter defeat. "Wait until winter," she said, echoing the mayor, the miners, the entire town. It was their mantra of disbelief, their final, unassailable argument. "Winter will show you." Ilara nodded. "Yes," she said. "It will." The work had a rhythm that subsumed time. Dawn broke with the clang of her hammer on a steel wedge, splitting stone. The day was measured in the number of timbers hauled and set, the number of foundation blocks levered into place. Silas was her partner in a slow, powerful dance. He learned the meaning of a slight tug on the reins, the difference in her tone when she needed a steady pull versus a sudden, jarring one. Together, they moved what a team of 6 men would have called a hard day's work. She grew leaner, her muscles cording in her arms and back. The skin of her hands became a landscape of calluses, crisscrossed with cuts that she cleaned meticulously each night by the light of a kerosene lamp. She spoke more to the mule than to any person. As she worked, she would narrate the pages of the journal. "Grandfather says the inner wall must be 2 feet thick, Silas. It creates a thermal mass. It breathes in the day's heat and breathes it out all night." Silas would flick an ear, his patient gaze fixed on her. He was the perfect audience, offering no argument, only a steady, reassuring presence. One afternoon, a young man appeared at the edge of the worksite. It was Liam, the blacksmith's son. He was lanky and quiet, with hands that seemed too large for his wrists, stained with the permanent grime of the forge. He didn't mock or offer advice. He just watched, his expression one of genuine curiosity. He stayed for nearly an hour before Ilara finally acknowledged him with a nod. "That's a clever winch system," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. He pointed to the A-frame and pulley she'd constructed from old mining equipment to lift the heavy roof beams. "It's my grandfather's design," she replied, not breaking her rhythm as she secured a rope. "He was a smart man," Liam said. It was the first time in a year anyone had said something kind about her family. He started coming by every few days. He never offered help directly, knowing her pride wouldn't allow her to accept it. Instead, he'd notice a dull axe and say, "I've got the forge hot. I could put a new edge on that for you." He'd see a frayed rope and return the next day with a new one, coiled neatly. "Found this in the old supply shed. No one's using it." Each was a small gesture of faith, a quiet vote cast against the town's consensus. One evening, he brought 2 baked potatoes, still warm and wrapped in cloth. They sat on a pile of timbers, Silas munching nearby, and watched the sun set behind the jagged peaks. The sky bled from orange to a deep, bruised purple. "Why are you doing this, Ilara?" Liam asked, not with judgment, but with a need to understand. She looked at the structure, now a formidable stone and timber skeleton dug into the earth. The framework for the glass panels on the south-facing wall was in place. The deep trench to the geothermal vent was lined with stone and capped, leading into the foundation. "The mines are dead," she said simply. "But the mountain isn't. People think the silver was the gift. They're wrong. The warmth is the gift." The silver was just the bait. Liam looked from the structure to her face, illuminated by the fading light. He saw the certainty there, an assurance as solid as the foundations she had laid. He nodded slowly. "I think I see," he said. Autumn deepened. The aspen groves in the valley turned a brilliant, trembling gold, then shed their leaves like a shower of coins. The air grew a sharper edge. The first hard frost coated the world in a brittle layer of white, making each blade of grass crunch underfoot. The skeptics grew bolder as the cold vindicated their predictions. "That hole will fill with snow and ice before the first real storm is over," Jedediah Thorne proclaimed to the men gathered at the town's last operating saloon. "She's built herself a cold, dark grave." Mayor Thompson began referring to the project as the Miller Folly. He spoke of having it dismantled in the spring for safety reasons, a statement met with grim nods. The town was contracting, pulling into itself for the coming winter. The last of the wagons had departed. The pass would soon be snowed in. Silver Creek was on its own. Ilara worked with a fierce, quiet urgency. The last of the heavy stone was in place. Now it was the glass. Crates of it, salvaged from the abandoned mine supervisor's office and other grander buildings, paid for with the last of her father's savings. Each panel was heavy and unwieldy. Getting them up the slope was a nightmare. Silas, steady as ever, pulled the carefully loaded sledge, taking one slow, deliberate step at a time. Ilara guided it, her muscles burning with the effort of keeping it balanced. One slip would mean a cascade of shattered glass, the end of the entire project. She spent 2 weeks setting the panels into the timber frames, sealing them with a mixture of pine tar and clay. It was painstaking work. A single crack would compromise the entire system. Liam appeared one morning as she was struggling to hoist a particularly large upper panel into place. She was on a ladder, heaving, the glass threatening to tip. Before she could protest, he was at the base, his strong hands taking the weight. "Just tell me where," he said. Together, they set the panel, and the next one, and the one after that. They worked in a shared silence, their movements synchronized, a team forged without discussion. When the last piece of glass was sealed, they stood back. The low afternoon sun poured through the angled wall, illuminating the vast interior space. The floor was packed earth, the walls were raw stone and timber, but it felt like a cathedral. A faint, moist warmth already radiated from the stone-capped trench at the back. The geothermal vent was working. "It'll work," Ilara said, the words a quiet exhalation of a year's worth of effort. Liam looked at her, then back at the light-filled space. He reached out and placed a hand on the inner stone wall. It was cool, but not cold. It felt solid, permanent. "Yes," he said, echoing her certainty. "It will." The first snows were light, a dusting that melted by noon, but the sky began to change. It took on a permanent, leaden-gray cast. The wind picked up, a high, keening sound that never seemed to stop. It stripped the last stubborn leaves from the oaks and sent dust devils dancing down the town's main street. Animals grew scarce. The usual chatter of squirrels and jays fell silent. An old Ute trapper, passing through on his way to lower elevations, stopped at the saloon for a whiskey. He took one look at the sky, at the way the smoke from the chimneys was being beaten back down, and shook his head. "You folks settle in," he'd said, his voice a dry rustle. "The sky is shutting its eye. This ain't a storm coming. It's a season. The kind my grandfather told me about. A white death." No one paid him much mind. They were mountain folk. They knew winter. The blizzard began not with flakes, but with a wall of white that moved down from the peaks, erasing the world. It struck the town with the force of a physical blow. The wind was a solid thing, a battering ram that shook buildings to their foundations and drove snow into every crack and crevice. The temperature plummeted. 10 below, 20, 30. The air itself seemed to freeze, so cold it hurt to breathe. Inside her shelter, Alara felt the first impact as a deep thrum that vibrated through the stone walls. Silas, stabled in a sturdy pen she had built in the corner, shifted nervously. She went to him, stroking his neck, her voice a low murmur. The wind shrieked over the roof, but inside, the sound was muffled, distant. The thick, earth-banked walls held. The triple-paned glass shuddered but did not break. She lit a single lantern. Its light reflected off the stone, filling the space with a calm yellow glow. The heart of the structure was the geothermal vent. Where the stone-capped trench ended, she had built a wide, shallow cistern lined with flat rocks. Steam rose from it in a steady, silent cloud, carrying the planet's deep warmth into the air. The temperature inside the vast space held at a steady 50 degrees. It was not warm, but it was a world away from the lethal cold outside. She had a small, efficient wood stove for cooking and extra heat, fueled by a massive stack of wood she and Silas had hauled for months. Her root cellar, dug deep into the back wall, was filled with potatoes, carrots, dried beans, and smoked fish. She was safe. She was ready. For 3 days the storm raged without pause. The world was reduced to the howl of the wind and the white fury visible through the glass panels. Snow piled up against them, darkening the interior, but the weight was borne by the heavy timbers, just as the journal said it would be. On the 4th day the wind slackened, and on the 5th it stopped. Silence. A profound, ringing silence that was more unnerving than the storm's roar. Alara unbarred the heavy door, a solid thing of layered planks she had built to withstand a battering ram. She had to shove hard against a drift, but it opened. She stepped out into a transformed world. Everything was gone. The landscape was a rolling desert of white, sculpted by the wind into massive dunes and razor-backed ridges. The town of Silver Creek had vanished, buried. Only the tops of the tallest buildings, the church steeple, the second story of the hotel, were visible, poking through a blanket of snow that was 15, in some places 20, feet deep. A single thin tendril of smoke rose from one chimney. Just one. A cold dread, colder than the air, settled in her chest. She had built her shelter for her own survival. She had not considered the alternative. Down in the buried town, the silence was one of desperation. The blizzard had been catastrophic. The sheer weight of the snow had collapsed roofs. The wind had shattered windows and blasted doors from their hinges. Families were trapped in freezing, dark houses, their woodpiles buried, their food supplies dwindling. The cold was relentless, seeping through walls, turning every draft into a dagger of ice. Jedediah Thorne's root cellar had caved in, taking most of his winter supplies with it. His wife was sick, her breath coming in shallow, rattling gasps. Mayor Thompson's grand house had lost half its windows, and he and his family were huddled in the kitchen, burning their furniture to stay alive. Martha Gable's roof had held, but she was down to her last few logs, rationing them out, her home growing colder by the hour. It was Liam who thought of her. His father's smithy was a wreck, the roof sagging dangerously. They were cold, hungry, and losing hope. Then he remembered. The Miller Folly, the tomb. He remembered the steam rising from the vent. He remembered the look of certainty on Alara's face. "She's alive," he said to his father, the words forming puffs of white in the frigid air. "I know she is." It took him and 3 other men, including Jedediah Thorne, half a day to struggle the few hundred yards to her claim. They had no snowshoes, so they floundered through the massive drifts, sometimes sinking to their chests. The cold was a living predator, clawing at their exposed skin. Thorne, his face grim and gray, was sure they were on a fool's errand, searching for a frozen corpse. They saw it first as a dark shape against the endless white. A long, low mound of stone and timber, its glass face reflecting the pale, featureless sky. A plume of steam rose from a stone chimney at its back, unwavering in the still air. As they got closer, they saw the impossible. The entrance was shoveled clear. Liam pushed the heavy door open and stumbled inside. The other men followed, blinking as their eyes adjusted from the blinding snow glare. They were met not with cold and darkness, but with a soft, lantern-lit warmth. The air was moist and smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and something else. Life. Alara stood by the stove, a pot of soup simmering. Silas watched them from his pen, his large eyes calm. Jedediah Thorne stopped dead, his mouth falling open. He stared at the stone walls, the massive beams, the light filtering through the snow-caked glass. He looked at the steaming cistern at the back, the source of the impossible warmth. He saw the neat stacks of firewood, the well-organized shelves of preserved food. He saw a sanctuary, an ark built on a scale he could not have imagined. He looked at Alara, this quiet, stubborn girl the whole town had mocked. He saw no triumph in her eyes, only a calm, weary resolve. "I'll be damned," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. He took off his hat, his frost-rimed hair steaming in the warm air. "Your grandfather was a genius." He took a step closer, his gaze meeting hers. "And you listened." He swallowed hard, the proud set of his jaw crumbling. "We were wrong, girl. I was wrong. I'm sorry." Alara simply nodded. "There's soup," she said. "Bring the others." That single act opened the floodgates. The shelter, derisively called the Miller Folly, became the town's heart, its only hope. The able-bodied men, led by Liam and a humbled Jedediah, worked in shifts to dig tunnels through the snow, connecting the buried houses, rescuing the trapped and freezing. The weak, the sick, and the children were brought to Alara's structure. It was given a new name, spoken first by Martha Gable as she settled a group of shivering children near the warmth of the cistern. "The Hearth," she called it. The name stuck. Alara became the quiet center of this new, condensed community. She didn't give orders, but people listened when she spoke. Her short, declarative statements cut through panic and debate. "We ration the food. The sick stay by the vent. We need more light." She moved through the crowded space with a calm purpose, tending to the sick with Martha, organizing supplies with Jedediah, planning the daily work with Liam. She showed them how the systems her grandfather had designed worked, how to regulate the heat by partially covering the cistern, how to bank the stove to make the wood last. Mayor Thompson was among the last to be rescued. He entered the hearth not with authority, but as a refugee, his fine clothes torn and dirty, his face etched with shame. He found a spot in a corner and remained silent, watching the community he had failed to lead be saved by the girl he had ridiculed. The winter held Silver Creek in its frozen grip for 3 long months. The snow did not melt, more fell. The world outside the hearth was a static, white wasteland. Inside, life went on. A baby was born. An old man died and was buried in a snow vault to be interred in the spring. They told stories, shared meager meals, and survived, huddled together in the impossible warmth that came from the earth. They were bound not by the memory of silver, but by the reality of shared hardship and the quiet strength of the woman who had prepared for it. When the thaw finally came, it was slow and reluctant. The world dripped for weeks. The snowpack receded inch by inch, revealing the devastation. The town was a wreck. Dozens of buildings were damaged beyond repair. But the people were alive. As the ground reappeared, they did not speak of leaving. The killer winter had broken their pride, but it had not broken their spirit. It had shown them a new way. The hearth was no longer just a shelter. It was a blueprint. Jedediah Thorne, his miner's knowledge of rock now repurposed, became Alara's most ardent student. He studied her grandfather's journals, his old skepticism replaced by a convert's zeal. "It's all here," he'd say to the others, tapping a diagram. "The heat sink principles, the load-bearing calculations. We can do this. We can all do this." Guided by Alara, and with Liam organizing the labor, they began to rebuild Silver Creek. They didn't rebuild the flimsy wooden structures that had failed them. They dug into the hillsides, using the principles of the hearth. They built smaller, semi-subterranean homes with stone foundations, earth-banked walls, and south-facing glass. They learned to find the subtle signs of geothermal activity, the places where the snow melted first. Ilara never lectured. She showed them. She'd take a shovel, walk a slope, and point. "Dig here," she'd say, and they would find the warmth. The town was no longer a mining camp waiting to die. It was becoming something else, something hardy and sustainable. The first thing they built inside the hearth, once the refugees moved into their new homes, was a series of deep, irrigated planting beds against the back wall. In the constant gentle heat and the light from the glass wall, seeds sprouted. By late spring, while the outside world was still a sea of mud, tiny green shoots of lettuce, spinach, and peas pushed up from the soil. The sight of them brought tears to Martha Gable's eyes. It was a miracle greater than any vein of silver. Years passed. The scars of the great winter faded, replaced by the signs of a new kind of prosperity. Silver Creek became known not for the metal it had once produced, but for the impossible gardens that flourished through its harsh winters. Traders who braved the pass in early spring were astonished to find fresh greens and hardy vegetables, all grown in the town's many hearthhouses. The knowledge, once the secret of a dead engineer and his quiet granddaughter, became the town's collective wisdom, its most precious asset. Ilara and Liam married. They didn't have a ceremony in the cold, drafty church. They stood in the center of the hearth, surrounded by the community they had helped save, and made their promises. Their children were born there, taking their first steps on the warm, packed earth. Ilara remained the town's quiet anchor. She never held a formal position, but when a dispute arose or a difficult decision had to be made, people would find their way to her. They would talk, and she would listen, and her few, carefully chosen words would often illuminate the path forward. Silas grew old. His muzzle turned gray, his steps became slow and deliberate. He spent his final years in a sunny patch of the hearth's interior garden, dozing among the tomato vines. He was petted by every child in town, his gentle nature a living legend. One spring morning, Ilara found him lying in his favorite spot, his long life having ended peacefully in his sleep. With Liam's help, she buried him on the slope outside, under a young apple tree that had grown from a seed sprouted within the hearth. They carved a simple inscription into a flat river stone: Silas, a faithful friend. More years passed, flowing like the seasons. Alara's hair turned the color of snow. Her hands, though gnarled with age, were never idle. She taught her grandchildren how to read the earth, how to seal glass against the wind, how to feel the deep, slow pulse of the mountain's warmth. She would sit with him on the bench outside the hearth, now a sprawling complex of interconnected structures, and point to the original foundation stone, the one she and Silas had struggled so hard to move. "Everything starts with one stone," she would tell them. "You just have to be stubborn enough to move it." She outlived Jedediah and Martha, and even the disgraced Mayor Thompson. She saw the town she had saved become a beacon of resilience, a place people came to learn from, not to abandon. Her grandfather's name, once associated with failure, was now spoken with reverence. His journals were carefully preserved, copied by hand, the town's founding documents. She died as she had lived, quietly and without fuss. She passed in her own bed within the walls of the hearth on a cold winter's night, with the wind howling outside and her family safe and warm around her. The entire town mourned, a community bound together by the legacy of her persistence. They buried her next to Silas, under the branches of the now mature apple tree. They did not mourn her as a loss, but celebrated her as a foundation. Inside the hearth, next to the entrance, they placed a simple bronze plaque, forged by Liam's grandson in the old smithy. It was mounted on the massive stone wall she had built with her own 2 hands. It did not list dates or accomplishments. It said only, "Elara Thorne Miller, she built our home." Long after she was gone, when the snows came and the passes closed, the people of Silver Creek would gather in the hearth. They would feel the gentle warmth rising from the stones, watch the green things grow under the glass, and tell the story of the quiet girl and her mule who, when faced with the world's doubt, had simply picked up a pry bar and gone to work. The structure stood, a part of the mountain itself, its steam rising like a steady breath into the cold winter air, a permanent monument not to a single person, but to the enduring power of listening to the earth.